You've never been told this story. History has buried it under layers of polite forgetfulness, but what I'm about to reveal will linger in your mind long after the screen goes dark. Picture a vast, isolated estate in the summer of 1869, in a place where law and morality were flexible, where cruelty could exist with impunity. A widow, enormous in size, a woman whose body had become a living weapon, presided over hundreds of lives as if she were the final arbiter of fate itself. 600 pounds of flesh, yes, but her power was not merely physical. It was absolute, psychological, and terrifying. Her slaves, 11 young men and women, lived beneath her shadow in constant fear. Each day was measured not in hours, but in the unpredictable swings of her temperament, the sudden eruptions of her cruelty, the invisible rules she imposed. They were children, adolescents barely grown, forced into servitude that tested body and mind. They understood the stakes: one misstep, one wrong glance, and the consequences were more than punishment. They were annihilation. And yet, they were human. And even in their despair, even under the suffocating weight of dominance, the seeds of rebellion were already planted. On that estate, life was more than survival. It was a system of control meticulously cultivated over decades. The widow had inherited not just wealth, but a culture of manipulation, fear, and corruption. She understood how to bend minds and bodies to her will, how to extract obedience without overt threat until the moment of absolute force. She had studied human behavior as if it were a weapon, and in her calculations, she had never anticipated that those she deemed weak, those she crushed beneath her daily dominion, would find a spark of audacity, a pulse of defiance strong enough to challenge her. The psychological landscape of this estate is one of shadows and whispers. Every gesture, every glance, every word carried meaning, encoded into a system of fear that kept the slaves in line. It was more than slavery. It was an experiment in dominance, control, and the human spirit's breaking point. The widow's massive frame was a symbol, yes, but it was also the focal point of a deeper structure, a network of coercion, psychological conditioning, and terror that few could survive without fracturing. Tonight, I will pull you into this forbidden world, strip away the polite narratives of history, and show you the machinery of power that crushed 11 young souls beneath the weight of one human body, and how, against all odds, defiance ignited. The story that follows is not just about cruelty. It is about the awakening of resistance, the anatomy of fear, and the dangerous, forbidden truths of human control. The widow's mind was as formidable as her body, perhaps even more terrifying. 600 pounds of sheer presence were only the most visible manifestation of power. Beneath it lay a mind honed to manipulate, to intimidate, to extract obedience through a combination of terror, reward, and unpredictability. She studied the young slaves as one might study a lab experiment, minute by minute, noting weaknesses, reactions, fears, and moments of hesitation. Every glance, every stumble, every whispered word was catalogued in her memory, later to be turned against them with precise, devastating effect. Her cruelty was deliberate. It was never mindless, never impulsive. She understood that breaking someone physically is temporary. Breaking them psychologically is eternal. She cultivated a system of control that was invisible until it struck with force. Some days, she allowed minor freedoms, small gestures of autonomy, only to snatch them away with sudden ferocity, teaching the slaves that safety is an illusion. The unpredictability itself became a weapon, a psychological trap from which escape was impossible. They were trained, day by day, to anticipate the next strike, but the next strike was never the one they expected. The estate itself amplified her influence. Its halls, ceilings, and floors were silent witnesses to decades of authority imposed and reinforced. Servants knew instinctively when to speak and when to remain silent. Shadows became instruments of fear. Even the air seemed to carry the widow's presence, heavy and suffocating, a constant reminder of surveillance and dominion. Her power was not simply exercised. It was woven into the very fabric of the place, into the minds and bodies of those trapped within it. Yet, the most insidious part of her control was her ability to convert obedience into dependency. The slaves were not merely afraid. They were trained to crave her approval, to internalize her authority, and to accept that their survival hinged entirely on her whims. Fear became a lesson in obedience, and submission was rewarded with the barest reprieve. Within this calculated oppression, hope was an enemy. Any spark of independence or defiance was crushed quickly, often publicly, as a warning to others. And yet, it is in this environment of relentless control that the seeds of rebellion take root. When tyranny is so complete, when every body and mind is measured, catalogued, and suppressed, the human spirit begins to whisper secrets even the most oppressive force cannot entirely suppress. The 11 young slaves, though terrified and trapped, carried within them the faint pulse of resistance. It was hidden, quiet, yet persistent, a dangerous ember in the shadow of overwhelming power. Every day on the estate was a calculated torment, a choreography of fear designed to reinforce the widow's absolute dominance. The young slaves moved under her gaze as though she were a gravity all their bodies and minds could not escape. Each task was not just labor. It was a test, a demonstration of obedience, a lesson in hierarchy. A misstep, a whispered word, even a glance held too long, could invoke punishment, often cruelly precise. Their lives were a perpetual exercise in anticipation, learning to read subtle shifts in her mood, the almost imperceptible signs of anger, pleasure, or caprice. The widow's cruelty was multidimensional. Physical weight was only one instrument. She had mastered the psychological, the slow, grinding manipulation of thought, desire, and expectation. Sometimes, she allowed small comforts, a soft word, a brief relief, only to snatch them away with sudden force. This unpredictability created a system of mental bondage. The slaves learned to live in a state of constant tension, their nerves taut, their attention unceasing. Sleep became a fraught interval, a temporary reprieve that always ended with the return of surveillance and domination. Their minds were under siege long before their bodies felt the first touch of coercion. But subtlety alone could not sustain total control. The widow's sighs became a weapon, an instrument of lethal inevitability. In moments of overt threat, her presence was inescapable. Hallways narrowed, doors closed silently, and her mask became a literal and symbolic pressure that crushed resistance before it could form. It was a dominance that was both terrifyingly physical and psychically invasive. The knowledge that any misjudgment, any hesitation, could result in instant, irreversible punishment. Fear was constant, internalized, and perfected. Yet, within the shadows of this oppression, flickers of rebellion began to emerge. Small gestures, almost imperceptible, revealed the young slaves' growing awareness that survival and compliance were not identical to submission. Secret conversations, exchanged glances, and carefully hidden acts of defiance became their lifeline. They began to understand the patterns of her cruelty, the rhythm, the timing, the psychological gaps between observation and action. Even in terror, the mind seeks opportunity. Even in chains, the spirit seeks freedom. This was the paradox of absolute control. The more total the oppression, the more potent the seed of defiance becomes. And in this house, in 1869, on that isolated estate, those 11 young slaves began to plan, not in haste, not in anger, but in calculated anticipation of the moment when survival required not just obedience, but rebellion. They were learning a dangerous truth. The human will, even under the most extreme domination, cannot be extinguished entirely. The widow's punishments were spectacles designed to instill terror, both physical and psychological. Each transgression, no matter how minor, became a demonstration of absolute authority. The estate's halls echoed with the cries of those who faltered, a chilling symphony meant to remind every eye and ear that resistance was fatal. She wielded her immense body with precision, descending upon offenders like a force of nature. Bones were broken, bruises marked flesh, and fear was etched into the minds of witnesses long after the echoes faded. It was not just pain she inflicted, it was mastery, a lesson in helplessness, a reinforcement of the system she had perfected over decades. Yet, in these public punishments, something unexpected began to occur. The young slaves watched, memorized, and calculated. Every gesture, every overreach, every pattern in her anger was a thread they could exploit. Fear did not vanish, it sharpened their awareness. The widow's size and strength were formidable, but she relied on predictability within chaos, on the consistency of her own habits and impulses. And in observing those patterns, the slaves discovered gaps, fleeting moments of opportunity where defiance could exist, subtle and hidden, without immediate reprisal. They began with small acts. A hand not trembling in terror when touched. A glance held a moment too long, testing recognition of rebellion. a whispered word shared in the shadows of the estate, a secret only they understood. Each act was calculated, deliberate, and hidden, designed to probe the limits of the widow's control. The estate itself, with its silent walls and omnipresent shadows, became their ally in concealment. Fear remained, yes, but it became a tool, an instrument that heightened perception and sharpened strategy. The psychological tension mounted. The widow's punishments were severe, yet her attention could not be everywhere at once. The slaves discovered that within the meticulous oppression, within the calculated terror, there existed unguarded spaces, moments where survival could intersect with planning. The more absolute the cruelty, the more exacting the observation of weaknesses became essential. They learned patience, restraint, and the dangerous art of anticipation. Every heartbeat, every breath, every subtle glance became a measure of readiness. This is the paradox of domination. Total control inevitably exposes a system to subtle cracks, the seeds of revolt. Even under immense pressure, even beneath crushing authority, human consciousness seeks escape. And so, the 11 young slaves, terrified yet unbroken, began to transform fear into strategy, helplessness into opportunity, and observation into a plan that would challenge a force of nature herself, the 600-pound widow who believed she could crush both body and spirit without resistance. There comes a moment in every system of domination when the oppressed realize something their captor never expects, that fear can be repurposed. That terror, when stretched too thin, becomes a map revealing the exact shape of the tyrant's vulnerabilities. And on that plantation, in the stale heat of 1869, those 11 young slaves began to sense the impossible. The widow who crushed bodies could be studied, and a force that can be studied can be defeated. The first act of rebellion was not a shout, nor a blade, nor a raised hand. It was a silence, an intentional, weaponized silence. One of the boys, Samuel, barely 13, stopped sobbing during punishment. The widow noticed. She always noticed. But she mistook it for brokenness. She did not realize silence can mean surrender, or calculation. She did not understand that the absence of fear is not peace. It is preparation. The slaves began to communicate in strands of sound barely above breath. 4 clicks of the tongue meant watch the whole way. 2 meant hide. 1 meant danger. A slow scrape of the foot across the dirt meant she was coming. A sharp exhale meant her rage was rising. They formed an invisible network, a language beneath language, a code hidden within panic. At night they lay awake, cramped in the dark, sharing slivers of knowledge. They studied how the widow ascended stairs, slow on the 3rd step, heavy on the 5th. They memorized the timing of her meals, when she napped, when she raged, when she grew breathless. They learned that when she exerted her self-crushing punishment upon another, she weakened for minutes afterward, her breath heaving, her balance unstable. In these fragments, a strategy began to knit itself together. A rebellion does not begin with violence. It begins with awareness, with the realization that a tyrant, no matter how monstrous, is still human enough to bleed, to fall, to crack under the right pressure. But the true spark came during a storm. Lightning split the sky, thunder rattled the walls, and the widow stumbled, bracing herself against the doorframe. 11 pairs of eyes saw it, a moment where gravity nearly defeated her, a moment where her sheer mass worked against her, a moment where the myth of her invincibility fractured. Samuel whispered the words that would change their fate. She can fall. 3 words. 3 syllables. A prophecy disguised as courage. The others felt it too. Something ancient, primal, electric. Fear did not vanish, but it evolved. It no longer chained them. It armed them. And from that moment on, rebellion was not a dream. It was inevitable. The night those words were spoken, she can fall, the air inside the slave quarters changed. It thickened, almost humming, as if the walls themselves understood that something forbidden had just been born. 11 young souls, exhausted, bruised, half-starved, felt a shift inside themselves that no overseer, no chain, no crushing weight could suppress. Awareness had ignited something deeper than bravery, something older than fear and older than tyranny itself. Rebellion is not an action. It is a psychological pivot, a moment where the mind stops bowing, even if the body still must. And once a mind stands upright, no captor can fully crush it again. They woke the next morning not with hope. Hope is too fragile, but with calculation. Each step they took was measured, deliberate, observant. Their eyes tracked everything: her footsteps, the creaking of floorboards, the way dust shifted when she approached, the quiver in servants who carried her food, the tremor in her breath when she moved too quickly. They discovered the truth tyrants never want understood: absolute power always weakens itself. The widow's greatest weapon, her immense weight, was also her greatest vulnerability. She could crush one boy, maybe two, but she couldn't chase, couldn't pivot fast, couldn't rise quickly if pushed to the ground. And though she believed fear paralyzed her victims, she failed to realize that fear also sharpens instinct. It breeds intelligence. It forges unity among those who share the same terror. For weeks, the 11 trained in secrecy, not with swords or spears, but with timing, coordination, and nerve. They practiced moving silently across the date. They rehearsed passing knives between each other without a sound. They learned to stand near her only when forced and to vanish the instant her rage stayed. They marked the weak points in her home: the narrow hallway where she had to turn sideways, the staircase that groaned under her weight, the corridor where her lantern cast a long shadow that revealed her position long before she arrived. But the most important training was internal. They hardened their minds. They prepared themselves for the moment where hesitation meant death. Still, there was one more thing they needed before the uprising could begin. Not just opportunity, but alignment. A moment where each of them moved with the same intention at the same instant, without fear, without doubt, without flinching. And that moment came unexpectedly, carried not by courage but by cruelty. One morning, as the widow dragged a young girl toward the punishment chamber, something snapped, not in her, but in the others watching. The widow did not see their eyes as she passed. She did not feel the tension surrounding her. She did not understand that she had crossed the threshold where terror no longer kept them obedient. It pushed them into clarity. As thunder rolled in the distance, 11 silent figures exchanged a single look. No words, no whispers, only understanding. The rebellion was no longer a plan. It had become a countdown. The countdown began in the most unremarkable way, through the slow rumble of distant thunder and the heavy breathing of the widow as she dragged that trembling girl across the floor. The storm outside had not yet arrived, but its warning was enough to electrify the air. Storms changed everything: weakened lantern light, masked footsteps, and cloaked whispers beneath the roar of rain. Storms were nature's way of blurring the line between chaos and opportunity. The 11 stood together in the corridor, still, silent, but no longer submissive. The widow lumbered forward, oblivious to the shift, her steps shaking dust from ceiling beams as she pulled the girl toward the punishment room. The girl's terrified eyes met theirs only once, and in that instant, every heart in the group locked onto the same truth: if they didn't intervene soon, one of their own would be destroyed. But immediate revolt meant suicide. Timing was their only weapon. So they watched and waited. And in that waiting, a new kind of unity formed, a unity built not on fear, but on a shared vow. The first sign came when the widow paused. She braced herself on the doorframe, struggling for breath. Her own weight pressed against her joints like a burden she could barely control. Sweat rolled from her forehead as she tried to force the girl inside, and for the first time, the 11 didn't see a monster. They saw a flaw. A slow, lumbering weakness disguised as dominance. Even tyrants tire. Even giants falter. Even cruelty has limits. As she leaned forward, the hallway groaned beneath her mass. The floorboards protested. The walls vibrated. And the storm finally broke open with a violent crack of thunder that made the entire house tremble. The slaves didn't move, yet, but they learned something priceless. They learned that the widow was not untouchable. That night, when the world outside drowned in rain, they gathered in the shadows and began speaking of tactics, not dreams, not courage, but tactics. Practical, dangerous, razor-thin strategies. They discussed the knives they could steal, small things, meant for the kitchen, but sharp enough to matter. They mapped out the rooms where she moved slowest. They plotted how to divide her attention, how to force her into narrow spaces, how to weaken her fitting. And most importantly, they laid out a rule that would determine success or death. None of them could act alone. They would rise together, or not rise at all. Because a tyrant can crush one, she can crush two. But 11 moving with one mind. That is how empires fall. The night ended with a pact, not spoken loudly, but whispered like a scripture. When she harms the next one, we rise. It was not a threat. It was a promise. And in that dark house, with rain pounding the earth and fear transforming into strategy, the countdown narrowed. From months to days. From days to moments. The widow had no idea that the knives of rebellion were already sharpening in the dark. The storm faded by morning, but the pact forged in its darkness did not. It lingered in every glance, every breath, every silent exchange between the 11. They moved through the estate with a strange calm, as if something inside them had settled. Not peace, but resolve. The kind of resolve men discover only when there is no turning back. The widow sensed nothing. Tyrants rarely do. They mistake quiet for obedience, stillness for submission. They never recognize the silence that forms before a strike. The day unfolded with a deceptive normalcy. She barked orders, and the house trembled under her movements. The slaves responded as they always had, quickly, respectfully, avoiding her gaze. But beneath that surface obedience was a razor edge. They were watching her more closely than ever, counting her steps, tracking her fatigue, noting the way she favored her right knee after a long climb up the stairs, calculating how long she needed to catch her breath after punishing someone. Every detail mattered. Every floor was a doorway to possibility. Samuel slipped into the kitchen that afternoon. His fingers brushed the wooden handles of 2 small knives. Nothing grand, nothing theatrical. Just sharpened steel, plain and deadly. Tools of survival. He hid them beneath his shirt, breath slow, heartbeat steady. A single knife wasn't enough to topple someone her size, but knives were symbols. They meant commitment. They meant action. They meant they were no longer waiting for rescue that would never come. They were becoming the architects of their own escape. Meanwhile, Lena, the youngest girl, studied the widow's daily routine. She noticed something new. After her first meal, the widow tended to rest in her massive chair near the parlor window. She would sit there, slumped like a collapsing mountain, her breath heavy, eyelids lowering, fingers twitching from exhaustion. This was her weakest hour. This was the opening. Lena whispered the detail to the others, and like water finding cracks in a wall, the information seeped into the forming plan. Hours passed. The anticipation grew. Not fear, anticipation. The sensation of standing at the edge of a precipice, knowing the drop is inevitable and stepping forward is the only choice that still belongs to you. Every one of them felt it. The future was approaching, not slowly, but like a storm returning for its unfinished work. Then it finally happened. The trigger. The moment they had agreed upon. A boy named Jonah dropped a cup, not by accident, but intentionally. The widow turned, fury igniting in her eyes. Her voice cracked like a whip. She seized him by the wrist, dragging him toward the punishment room. The others froze, not in fear, but in recognition. This was it. This was the moment written in the storm, carved into their vow, sealed in silence. The widow disappeared into the hallway with Jonah. The door slammed, and the house went still. 11 pairs of lungs inhaled at once. The pact awakened, and the countdown reached 0. The walls shook with the widow's rage long before her voice emerged. Jonah's cry was muffled, swallowed by the thick wood of the punishment room, but the 11 heard enough. They knew what came next, the crushing weight, the suffocating pressure, the slow collapse of bone under a body built like a slaughtering machine. They had seen it too many times. Surviving it was not possible. Stopping it was now their only path forward. They exchanged one look. No words. No hesitation. The kind of look men share only once, when their souls agree to step into danger as one entity. Samuel tightened his grip around the knife hidden beneath his shirt. His heart beat with steady certainty. The decision had already been made in the storm. Now it was only becoming real. Lena, trembling but determined, placed herself near the doorframe. Her role was crucial, the spark to initiate the moment of imbalance. The others fanned through the hallway, each one taking their position like pieces in a ritual older than violence itself. Inside the room, the widow was breathing hard, heavy, strained, a rhythm they had memorized. Inhale, growl, exhale, collapse. Her fury blinded her to everything beyond the boy beneath her. She never noticed the faint creak of the hallway behind her. She never felt the shift in the atmosphere, the electricity of intention pressing against the door. She believed the world still belonged to her. But the world was changing, and she was the last to realize it. Samuel raised his hand. That was the signal. Not shouted, not whispered, just raised. 11 sets of lungs exhaled as one. The door opened without a sound, the hinges carefully oiled days earlier for this exact moment. The widow did not turn. She was too focused on smashing Jonah's resistance, her immense body pinning him, crushing him beneath layers of flesh and rage. Lena moved first. Barely a child, yet delivering the first blow of revolution. She slammed her foot into the side of a loose floorboard, the one the boys had purposely loosened, and the board flipped upward. The sound wasn't loud, but it was sharp, unexpected. A break in rhythm. The widow's head jerked toward it. Just enough. Just long enough. Samuel lunged. Not to strike, yet, but to grab Jonah's arm and wrench him out from beneath her mass before she came crashing down again. The move was desperate, reckless, perfect. Jonah slid free, gasping, eyes wide with disbelief. The widow roared, an inhuman, guttural sound of confusion and rage. She tried to push up, but her weight worked against her, slowing her ascent, making her balance fragile. 11 pairs of feet shifted. This was the moment they had rehearsed. 2 boys shoved a table toward her legs. One kicked the back of her knee. Another struck her shoulder with a wooden pestle. Not to kill, just to break her stability. The room thundered with movement, but the widow could not keep up. She twisted, flailed, slipped, her own body rebelling against her. And then she fell. Hard. The house shook with the impact. For the first time in her reign of terror, she was on the floor, and the 11 were standing over her. Not victims, not children, not slaves, but the architects of her downfall. For a moment, the room held its breath. Dust drifted through the air in slow motion as if the house itself were stunned by what had just occurred. The widow, this towering mountain of flesh and fury, lay sprawled across the wooden floor, her limbs splayed, her breath ragged, her power suddenly fragile. For the first time in years, she was beneath them, and the 11 young slaves stood above her, a circle of shadows cast by a single flickering lantern, their eyes blazing not with triumph, but with the terrifying clarity of those who understand the true cost of survival. The widow tried to rise. Her fingers clawed at the floorboards, dragging grooves into the wood. Her breath screeched as she attempted to roll herself upright. Rage twisted her face, but beneath it, something else flickered. Something she had never shown. Something she had never expected to feel. Faye. She had believed herself invincible, a force of nature too large, too cruel, too dominant to be challenged. But now, pinned by her own weight, surrounded by 11 pairs of eyes that no longer trembled, she understood that power is only unquestioned until the moment it is tested. And once tested, once resisted, the illusion collapses. Samuel stepped forward. His knife glinted, not raised, not plunging, simply present. The symbolism was enough. The widow's eyes widened. Her breathing faltered. The sound of her panic, real panic, filled the room in stark contrast to the screams she had once savored from her victims. "You will not hurt him again," Samuel said. His voice was low, steady, unshaken. He wasn't speaking to a monster. He was speaking to a dying empire. The widow lashed out suddenly. A desperate swipe of her arm meant to send him flying. But her reach was slow, predictable, telegraphed by the tremor in her muscles. The boys darted back with the timing they had practiced for nights. Every movement had purpose. Every step was part of the choreography of rebellion. 2 boys pushed a heavy chest toward her side. Another slammed the door shut behind them. They could not risk being heard or interrupted. The walls seemed to close in. The lantern shadows warped into long, jagged shapes across her body as she struggled. She tried to speak, to command, to scream for the overseer, but the words tangled in her throat. The 11 had seen her furious, cruel, merciless, but never powerless. This was the moment the myth shattered. Jonah, the youngest boy, stepped forward with a trembling hand. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need one. His courage was the blade. He stood over the woman who had nearly crushed him to death minutes earlier. She locked eyes with him, confusion spinning into disbelief. "Get up," he whispered. A challenge. A day she could no longer fulfill. Her body heaved, but her strength betrayed her. The fall had jarred her joints, twisted her ankles, knocked the wind from her lungs. Her weight, once a symbol of unstoppable force, had become her prison. The 11 did not smile. They did not celebrate. This was not victory. This was necessity. Because now came the part they feared most. The part no plan could soften. The part that would mark them forever. The widow lay there, heaving, trembling, stunned, her massive body sinking into the grooves of the floor she once ruled without challenge. The lantern flickered, casting her in a wavering glow that made her look less like a titan and more like a wounded creature cornered by its own brutality. The sound of her labored breath scraped through the room like metal against stone. She tried to command them, but power had left her voice. All that remained was a quivering rasp, an empire collapsing in real time. The 11 stood in a circle around her. Not triumphant, not bloodthirsty, just awakened. Men who tasted truth for the first time. Men who understood that after tonight, their lives would never return to what they were. Rebellion, once chosen, seals the path behind you. You either walk forward, or you fall. Samuel crouched beside her, not close enough to be struck, but close enough for her to hear him above her gasping. You built this house on fear, he said quietly. You thought fear would keep you safe. The widow stared at him. Sweat dripped from her face in thick lines. She blinked, disoriented, her mind scrambling to regain the authority she'd always wielded like a weapon. But fear, Samuel continued, cuts both ways. The room fell silent. Even the house seemed to hold its breath, sensing a fracture in the chains that bound it. The widow tried to raise her hand once more, but it trembled violently. Her size, once an advantage in brutality, had become a trap. She couldn't maneuver. She couldn't threaten effectively. She couldn't escape the 11 shadows closing around her. Every inch she tried to drag herself only made her weakness more obvious. Lena stepped forward. Her tiny frame contrasted sharply with the fallen tyrant. You think we're too small, she whispered. You think we're nothing. The widow's face twitched. Anger, panic, denial, but no dominance. We've been nothing, Lena said. Until tonight. A low crack of thunder rolled across the sky outside, as if the storm were returning to witness the final phase of the uprising it helped create. The wind whistled through the cracks in the window frame, swelling the silence into something tense and sacred. The boys moved with purpose now. They weren't improvising. They were following the plan they had built in secret, every motion born from weeks of observation. 2 held the door shut. 3 reinforced the chest blocking her legs. 4 positioned themselves at her sides. The remaining 2 hovered near Samuel, the knife glimmering faintly in his hand. The widow realized, truly realized, that they were not about to run. They were about to decide her fate. Her eyes widened. Her breath hitched. She understood. And for the first time in her life, she spoke without command, only fear. Don't, she choked. The 11 froze. Not out of mercy, but because this was the first time they had ever heard a plea from her lips. Samuel tightened his grip on the knife, not to strike, but to anchor himself. What do we do with her? He asked, voice low, steady, echoing the question haunting every mind in the room. No one answered at first. The weight of that choice hung thick in the air, until one voice rose, quiet, steady, certain. Jonah. We do, he said, what she would never do for us. The circle tightened, the moment sharpened, and the fate of the widow, this living mountain of cruelty, balanced on the edge of a single breath. Everything that came next would carve itself into their souls forever. The widow lay sprawled on the wooden floor, her massive body shaking from exertion, rage, and fear she had never before experienced. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a reminder that her strength, once unstoppable, had betrayed her. The 11 stood around her, silent, their shadows flickering in the lantern light, a circle of deliberate precision and lethal calm. Each of them understood that the moment of reckoning had arrived, not out of anger, but necessity. The room, once a stage of her domination, had transformed into the arena of their will. Every floorboard, every beam, every echoing wall bore witness to the shift. The power that had oppressed them for so long was now fragile, vulnerable, and within reach. They did not smile. They did not gloat. They only moved with the cold clarity of those who have stared at death and decided to act. Samuel, gripping the small kitchen knife he had hidden, approached with steady, purposeful steps, not to kill, but to enforce the first lesson the widow had never taught, that power is meaningless without control over one's own fate. The widow's eyes, wide and panicked, darted between them, the slow realization dawning that her body could no longer dominate, that the mass she had weaponized against others had become a prison. She attempted to rise, her hands clawing the floor, her breath rasping, but the 11 moved as one, silent and synchronized. 2 pushed her chest toward her legs, 1 jammed the door, and others positioned themselves around her, the room now an intricate web of containment. The widow's voice, once thunderous, now emerged as a strangled rasp. She tried to command, to threaten, but the weight of her failure and exhaustion robbed her of authority. Samuel leaned slightly closer, the knife glinting faintly in the lantern light, and said, "You built this house on fear. You thought fear would keep you safe. But fear cuts both ways." The widow's mouth opened, attempting to reply, but words failed her. The sound was only a gurgle, a faltering echo of what had once been terrifying commands. Jonah, the youngest, stepped forward, small but unyielding, and whispered, "We do what you would never do for us." The room seemed to pause, as if the very walls inhaled the statement, acknowledging the irreversible shift. The widow strained, tried to flail, but her movements were sluggish, miscalculated, betraying the exhaustion her tyranny had hidden until now. The lantern light flickered, shadows warped, and the house itself seemed to lean in, watching the final phase of her downfall. The 11 did not celebrate, did not rejoice, because they understood the gravity of the moment. This was not mere triumph. It was the birth of freedom forged in terror, precision, and unshakable courage. For the first time, the widow was beneath them, and they were no longer children, no longer victims. They were architects of a new order, standing in the echo of a shattered dominion, ready to define the rules of life and death in a house that had long been ruled by fear alone. The widow's groans echoed through the hallway like a wounded beast, but the 11 moved with absolute coordination, their minds sharpened by weeks of observation and silent rehearsal. Every movement she attempted was countered not with brute force, but with calculation, sliding a chest to block her legs, positioning a lantern to cast her in blinding shadows, leaning on walls to prevent her from rolling. The room had become a battlefield of patience and precision, not chaos, and each of them knew instinctively where to place their weight, how to hold their stance, and when to pause. Samuel remained close to the knife, but it was not the steel that held her attention. It was their unity, their unwavering gaze, the cold certainty that she no longer controlled the rhythm of the room. Her breaths came ragged, punctuated by gurgling screams of anger and disbelief, and with each exhale, the illusion of invincibility peeled away. She lunged, desperate, and the boys shifted almost imperceptibly, redirecting her momentum into the chest that now pinned her legs, forcing her to the ground again. She tried to roar, to summon the authority that had terrorized them for months, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by fatigue and the sudden awareness that the 11 had become one mind. In the flickering lantern light, their eyes were bright, unflinching, and they did not flinch because they had faced this for weeks, rehearsing the impossible, turning terror into strategy. The widow's own mass, once the source of fear and control, now betrayed her. Her arms flailed, knees buckled, and even the floor groaned under her immense weight, a grim accompaniment to the collapse of her dominion. Jonah stepped forward again, not to strike, but to anchor the plan. They had decided together that her fate was not in blood, but in complete subjugation reversed. He whispered to the others, and they synchronized their next moves. 2 pressed her shoulders to the floor, 3 reinforced the chest holding her legs, and the remaining watched for any misstep. The widow thrashed, and the room filled with the sound of impact, wood against flesh, bone protesting, the house itself seeming to shudder. Then a pause, a moment where all motion stopped, and the widow lay gasping, her eyes wide, staring at faces that no longer bowed in fear. Samuel crouched near her head, his knife now at rest, and said, "You believed you owned fear. But we have learned it, and it has made us stronger than you ever were." She tried to speak again, but only a rasp emerged, and the 11, standing over her, finally recognized the gravity. She had ruled through terror, but they had survived, observed, and transformed it into mastery. The widow was defeated, not by weapons, not by luck, but by the patient, deliberate will of those she underestimated. And in that room, silence fell, thick and absolute, a silence that marked the end of one era and the terrifying birth of another. The widow lay gasping, her massive frame trembling as though the very act of breathing had become a punishment, each exhale a reminder that the force she had wielded with impunity was now powerless against the 11 who had once cowered beneath her. The room smelled of sweat, dust, and fear, the same fear she had once weaponized, but now it belonged to her alone. The 11 moved deliberately, circling her like predators who no longer hunted but measured, calculating every angle, every shift in balance, every potential surge of her fury. Samuel's knife remained at his side, not threatening, but symbolic, a tether to the new order they were forging, a warning that precision and unity now held dominion over sheer weight and terror. She tried to push herself up, her hands clawing at the floorboards, nails digging into wood as if grasping for the last vestige of control. Her breaths came ragged, each one a high-pitched rasp of disbelief and rage, yet no command could escape her lips. The 11 did not flinch. They had watched, waited, and now they were the masters of the rhythm. Every subtle quiver of her body, every flicker of the eyes, every stifled groan became a cue for their movements. Lena, small but unyielding, stepped closer to observe the pattern of her exhaustion, the slight tilt of her shoulders, the way her massive legs faltered as she attempted leverage. Every imperfection, every human limitation they had observed in secret over weeks was now exploited. Jonah adjusted the chest, pinning her legs, creating a minor imbalance that forced her torso forward, her massive weight now a liability, her body betraying the myth she had constructed. The widow's roar erupted suddenly, a guttural sound meant to intimidate, but it struck hollow in the room that had become theirs. Samuel leaned close, voice steady, almost clinical, stating, "This is not vengeance. This is understanding. This is what power without conscience becomes when confronted by resolve." Her eyes, wide and glassy, betrayed the shock of realization. She had underestimated fear, resilience, and strategy combined. The 11 remained statuesque, yet their presence was electric, a silent wave of collective dominance. The widow's arms flailed once, twice, but coordination failed her. The floorboards creaked, the chest shifted slightly, and gravity worked against her for the first time in decades. The room seemed to pulse with tension, the walls witnesses to the collapse of tyranny. By now, all pretense of control had vanished. The widow's reign, built on terror and weight, lay shattered, and the 11, standing firm and silent, understood that they had not only survived, they had transformed fear into mastery, cruelty into leverage, and oppression into their own awakening. The widow's panic spread like a slow poison through the room, her massive body heaving with a terror she had never known. Her hands clawed at the floorboards, her fingers scraping wood, her nails splintering under the weight of desperation. Every breath was shallow, every muscle taut, a grotesque symphony of exhaustion and disbelief. The 11 remained still, moving only when necessary, their eyes locked on every twitch, every flinch, every moment of instability. Time had slowed to a crawl, yet in that stillness, the intensity of purpose was almost unbearable. Samuel stepped closer, his knife hanging at his side, a silent sentinel of the pact they had forged. This was not about blood, not yet. It was about mastery, about establishing control over a force that had seemed invincible. The widow's eyes darted from face to face, seeking weakness, hoping, pleading for some sign of mercy, some return to the old order that had kept her unchallenged. But there was none. Her terror was mirrored in the room's shadows, long and jagged, stretching across the floor as if the house itself had joined the revolt. Lena moved silently, noting the way the widow's arms wavered when she tried to rise, how her massive torso rocked unsteadily, how her legs could no longer hold the force they once commanded. Every detail had been catalogued in their minds, every flaw memorized, every movement anticipated. Jonah whispered to Samuel, confirming positions, subtle adjustments, the silent choreography of revolt executed flawlessly. The widow lunged once, twice, each attempt failing as her own mass betrayed her, the floorboard groaning in protest at the weight she had used for so long as an instrument of terror. The room vibrated with energy, not just from her movements, but from the silent intensity of those who had endured unimaginable cruelty and now stood at the threshold of liberation. Every flicker of lantern light, every shadow, every creak of timber became a weapon in their perception. She realized, too late, that her fear had become theirs, reshaped and returned with a precision she could not counter. Her fury escalated, but her strength faltered, every gesture slow, predictable, manipulated by the very children she had crushed in spirit and flesh. And in that moment, they understood the truth of domination. The body may be enormous, the will imposing, but even the greatest cruelty has limits when confronted by unity, observation, and the cold intelligence of those who have nothing left to lose. The widow's legacy of terror had ended, not with a scream of victory, but with the quiet realization that her power was shattered, and a new order, forged in fear, strategy, and resolve, had taken its place. The widow lay sprawled on the floor, her massive chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, a prisoner of her own weight and exhaustion. The 11 moved with a stillness that made the room feel charged, each second stretched taut with tension and anticipation. Every muscle in their bodies was coiled, ready, yet disciplined, the patience of months of observation distilled into this single moment of reckoning. Samuel's knife remained sheathed at his side, a silent emblem of authority and the promise of control over the chaos that had dominated their lives for so long. The widow tried to push herself upright, her arms shaking, knees wobbling under her own bulk, and for the first time, she realized the truth she had ignored all these years. Sheer size and brute force could not sustain tyranny without vigilance and awareness. The 11 had watched her patterns, memorized every detail of her movements, every rhythm of her breathing, every tiny flaw she exhibited when she exerted herself. Lena adjusted her position slightly, her eyes fixed on the widow's shoulders, noting how fatigue had altered her balance, and whispered to Jonah, who relayed the movement to the others with subtle gestures, a silent symphony of coordination. The widow roared, a raw, guttural sound meant to intimidate, but it fell flat in the charged air, echoing against walls that had long witnessed her cruelty and now seemed to absorb her panic. She attempted a desperate lunge, and the boys moved as one, redirecting her momentum against a heavy chest, her own weight turning into a weapon of her own imprisonment. Every struggle she made, every futile attempt to regain control, only reinforced the mastery of those who had endured her terror. The room seemed to pulse with energy, a dark, electric current, as the 11 shifted imperceptibly, guiding her faltering movements with precision. Her eyes widened, staring at each face, searching for a crack, a hint of hesitation, but found none. Fear had been transformed into strategy, and cruelty into resolve. The widow thrashed once more, heavy and cumbersome, yet the orchestration of the 11 was flawless. She could not escape, could not dominate, could not reclaim her narrative. Samuel leaned closer, voice low but firm, articulating a truth that would mark the moment forever. Power without awareness is nothing, and you have just discovered the limits of your own. Her gaze faltered, the realization sinking deep that the reign she had built on fear, pain, and domination had ended, not by chance, but by the deliberate, calculated will of those she had underestimated. In that charged silence, the 11 became more than survivors. They became the architects of a new order, their minds and bodies aligned, standing above the woman who had once crushed them beneath her weight, and understanding fully that the world of terror she had imposed could no longer exist while they remained awake, aware, and unbroken. The widow's massive frame twitched violently as she realized the full scope of her defeat. Her breaths came in jagged, shallow bursts, her voice reduced to a strangled rasp, and for the first time in years, the air in the house belonged not to her, but to those she had oppressed. The 11 stood in a tight circle, eyes unwavering, shadows stretching across the wooden floor like dark rivers flowing toward inevitability. Every inch of their bodies vibrated with the quiet intensity of purpose, discipline honed over weeks of observation, nights of fear converted into knowledge, months of silent plotting now culminating in absolute control. Samuel stepped forward, his knife glinting faintly in the lantern light, but not as a weapon to strike. It was a symbol, a testament to the calculated patience that had brought them to this moment. The widow tried to lunge, a desperate, uncontrolled motion, her massive limbs flailing, but momentum betrayed her. 2 boys pushed the chest into her side, reinforcing the grip of containment, while others adjusted positions to anticipate every shift of her weight. Her eyes darted frantically from face to face, searching for mercy, for hesitation, for any sign that the old order could be restored, but found none. Lena leaned slightly, observing the subtle tilt of her shoulders, the quiver in her knees, the way her massive arms no longer provided leverage but worked against her, and relayed the position silently, a conductor guiding a symphony of suppression. Jonah whispered a single word to Samuel, and like a pulse through their formation, the movement coordinated without sound. The widow roared again, a guttural, animalistic cry, and the room seemed to tremble under the vibration, but it was hollow. It carried no power, only the echo of a past built on fear, now repurposed into the strength of those who had endured it. The lantern light flickered, shadows stretching and dancing across walls that had witnessed too much suffering, and in those shadows, the 11 saw the limits of her reign crystallized, vulnerability, exhaustion, and panic, all converging in one massive, human body. Samuel's voice cut through the tension, low and commanding. Your terror was never absolute. We have learned it, and now we wield it. The widow's lips parted, words trapped, her massive chest rising and falling, but no command could escape her. Her reign had collapsed, not because of luck or force, but because she had underestimated the precision of observation, the unity of purpose, and the unshakable resolve of those she sought to crush. In that room, silence fell heavy and permanent, a monument to the transformation of fear into power, oppression into strategy, and victims into architects of a new order, standing tall above the woman who had once ruled them with iron weight and cruelty. The widow's defeat was not marked by celebration, nor by the hollow thrill of revenge. It was marked by the stillness that follows a storm, a tense, expectant quiet that pressed on every soul in the room. The 11 moved as one, their presence a living web of control, observing, calculating, ready for the smallest twitch that might betray another surge of her futile fury. The house seemed to bend around them, the walls creaking in acknowledgement, the floorboards groaning under centuries of silent suffering now given form in their dominance. Samuel adjusted his stance, knife at his side, the glint in the lantern light reflecting the precision of his intent. The widow, panting, eyes wide with disbelief, tried to force herself up, but her own mass worked against her, the momentum of previous struggles leaving her vulnerable to every subtle shift the 11 executed. 2 boys pressed the chest harder against her legs, ensuring her mobility remained compromised, while others fanned out to anticipate any desperate lunge. Lena's eyes tracked the smallest movements, noting how her shoulders trembled, how her knees wavered, how the massive arms that had crushed them now moved like lead, clumsy and ineffective. Jonah whispered instructions that rippled through the group without a sound, each member responding in perfect synchronicity, a silent orchestra conducting the containment of a tyrant. The widow attempted to scream, to command, to wield the power she believed eternal, but her voice cracked, reduced to raw, ineffective rasping. Samuel leaned forward, calm and commanding, and said, "You thought fear was yours to wield, but we have learned it, and it has become ours." Her eyes flicked to each figure, panic replacing the rage that had defined her, understanding for the first time that the unity, patience, and intellect of those she had oppressed were now the instruments of her undoing. The room's tension was palpable, every shadow cast by the flickering lanterns a testament to the fragile line between domination and submission. Every movement of the 11 reinforced the lesson. Sheer size and cruelty are meaningless when confronted by awareness, coordination, and relentless focus. The widow struggled, flailed, twisted, and yet the circle held, perfect and unyielding. Her reign, built on terror, had crumbled into a moment of absolute clarity. She was no longer in control. In that charged silence, the 11 understood the true nature of power. They had endured, observed, and transformed their fear into mastery. The widow's mass, her might, her cruelty, all had been neutralized by discipline and precision, and for the first time in her life, she lay beneath eyes that did not flinch, eyes that now dictated the rules. The house itself seemed to settle, as if acknowledging a new order. The moment was complete, irreversible, and the 11, standing unbroken, realized they had become something neither she nor history could ever erase, the embodiment of calculated, unstoppable resolve. The widow lay defeated, her body trembling with exhaustion, her massive frame a landscape of bruises and fatigue that betrayed every cruel act she had ever committed. The 11 stood around her like a silent tribunal, their eyes sharp, unblinking, absorbing every flicker of movement, every shallow breath, every flicker of panic that passed over her face. They had not acted out of vengeance. This was not retribution. It was awareness made manifest, patience refined into lethal precision. Samuel stepped closer, knife resting lightly at his side, not in threat but as a symbol of the new order taking shape, a quiet reminder that power without control is meaningless. The widow's chest heaved, her arms trembling as she tried, in vain, to regain her footing. Her eyes darted wildly from figure to figure, searching for hesitation, mercy, anything that could restore the illusion she had built over years of terror. But the 11 offered none. They had watched, memorized, calculated, and transformed fear into strategy, cruelty into leverage, weakness into opportunity. Lena adjusted her stance, noting the subtle shifts in the widow's balance, how exhaustion tilted her torso, how her legs faltered under her own mass, and related silently with a glance to Jonah, who responded with a slight nod. 2 of the boys pressed the chest against her legs, immobilizing her lower body, while others subtly reinforced the positions around her, creating a containment field born of intelligence and timing rather than brute force. The widow let out a guttural cry, raw and feral, an attempt to reclaim authority, but it struck hollow against the unity of the 11, a scream swallowed by calculated calm. Samuel's voice broke the tension, low and commanding. You believed fear belonged to you. You were wrong. And now you see its weight reversed. Her eyes widened as comprehension struck, a terrifying realization that her reign was over not because of luck, not because of chance, but because she had underestimated the patience, observation, and coordination of those she sought to crush. Every flail, every desperate attempt at leverage only confirmed the mastery of the 11. Every twitch became a signal, every tremor a cue, and the widow's power dissipated like smoke under a cold wind. The house seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the reversal, the absolute dominance of precision over oppression. The widow's legacy of terror had ended in silence, a silence filled with the hum of unbroken determination. In that charged stillness, the 11 stood as more than survivors. They were the architects of a new order, awakened by the dark truths of observation, endurance, and the cold inevitability of disciplined will. Her tyranny, once absolute, had collapsed under the weight of those she had sought to destroy, and nothing could restore it. The widow lay still for a moment, not from surrender, but because the raw reality of her defeat had finally caught up to her. Her massive chest heaved, arms sprawled, her breathing ragged and uneven, as if each inhale carried the weight of decades of cruelty now returned upon her. The 11 remained statuesque, a living web of precision and calculated control, watching her every motion, predicting her every desperate attempt to reclaim dominance. Samuel stepped slightly forward, knife at his side, its presence a quiet emblem of discipline, not violence. The widow's eyes darted around, searching for mercy, hesitation, any crack in the unyielding circle, but there was none. They had observed too long, planned too meticulously, endured too much. Her panic became their map, her exhaustion their tool, and her flailing, clumsy and predictable, revealed every vulnerability she had carefully hidden behind terror. 2 boys shifted the chest, pinning her legs, adjusting for her slightest movement, while Lena and Jonas subtly redistributed their weight, reinforcing the perimeter with the precision of a predator circling prey. The widow tried to push up again, massive arms trembling, but gravity and her own bulk betrayed her, her body resisting her commands. She let out a guttural scream, a sound meant to intimidate, but it was hollow, fractured by fatigue, and it echoed against the walls like a warning to no one. Samuel's voice cut through the tension, calm and commanding. Fear is not yours to wield. You see now what it can do in trained hands, in unified minds, in those who have nothing left to lose. The widow's lips quivered, the last vestige of authority slipping into disbelief. Each flail she made, each desperate shift, was counted before it became threat, every motion catalogued and neutralized by those she had underestimated. The lanterns flickered, casting her massive shadow across walls, but the illusion of dominance was gone, replaced by a terrifying clarity. She was powerless, contained, and fully exposed to the inevitability of their will. Her tyranny, built on weight and cruelty, lay in pieces around her trembling form. The 11 had not only survived, they had transformed fear into mastery, oppression into precision, and chaos into their own unbroken order. Silence settled heavily, a charged quiet that spoke louder than any roar she could muster. She had ruled through terror, and now she understood the truth of power. It is meaningless without respect, awareness, and the vigilance to recognize threats. The widow's fall was complete, and the 11 stood as architects of a new reality, witnesses to the collapse of what had once seemed invincible. The widow's massive body trembled with every heartbeat, her breaths uneven, ragged, each inhale a struggle against the crushing weight of realization that she had lost. The room around her seemed to hum with tension, the lantern light flickering across the 11 standing tall, their bodies poised, their eyes unwavering, their presence radiating the kind of control that comes only from surviving unthinkable oppression and turning it into precision. Samuel's knife hung at his side, not as a threat, but as a symbol, a reminder that authority had shifted from brute force to calculated awareness. The widow tried to rise, massive arms clawing at the floor, legs buckling under her own weight, but every movement was anticipated, every attempt neutralized by the silent, orchestrated unity surrounding her. 2 boys pushed the chest more firmly against her legs, creating an immovable barrier, while others adjusted subtly, fanning around her in perfect synchronicity, ensuring every angle of escape or flailing was blocked. Her eyes darted wildly from face to face, searching for hesitation, for mercy, for a return to the terror she had once commanded, but found only resolve. Lena moved lightly, observing the smallest tremor in the widow's shoulders, the wavering in her knees, the slackening in her massive arms, signaling each minor weakness to Jonah, who shifted the circle accordingly. The widow roared, a guttural, animalistic sound meant to intimidate, but it fell flat against the calculated calm of the 11. Samuel leaned forward, voice low but precise, cutting through the charged silence. You built power on fear. We have learned it. We have mastered it. And now, you see how fragile it truly is. The widow's eyes widened, comprehension dawning with terrifying clarity. Every desperate motion, every attempt to reclaim authority, was anticipated, blocked, and contained. The room seemed to breathe with the unity of the 11, walls and floorboards groaning like silent witnesses to the collapse of her dominance. Her tyranny, built on mass, fear, and cruelty, was shattered, replaced by the disciplined will of those she had sought to crush. She flailed, twisted, and gasped, but there was no reclaiming what had been lost. The shift was absolute. The 11 had become more than survivors. They were now the orchestrators of order, converting fear into strategy, oppression into awareness, and desperation into control. The widow, realizing the depth of her defeat, lay beneath them fully exposed, the embodiment of a fallen empire, and the 11, unflinching, held the room, the house, and the lesson of power itself, fully in their hands. The widow's body lay splayed, her massive weight pressing into the floorboards, a stark contrast to the silent, controlled precision of the 11 who now surrounded her. Her chest heaved, each breath a shallow rasp, a reminder of the helplessness that had replaced the reign she had long assumed untouchable. Samuel shifted slightly, knife at his side, not for attack but as a measure of authority, a visual punctuation of the new balance of power in the room. The widow attempted to rise once more, her arms quivering, legs wobbling, but her bulk betrayed her, making every movement predictable and easily counted. 2 boys reinforced the chest over her legs, ensuring she remained pinned, while the others subtly adjusted positions, their coordination flawless, a silent choreography that she could neither anticipate nor disrupt. Her eyes flicked frantically from face to face, searching for weakness, for hesitation, for the familiar fear that had once bent these 11 to her will, but found only focus, precision, and unflinching determination. Lena's gaze measured every micro-movement of the widow's shoulders, the slightest shift in her hips, and relayed it with a subtle nod to Jonah, who communicated through silent gestures the adjustments necessary to maintain complete control. The widow let out a low, guttural scream, a sound intended to command, to intimidate, to reassert the terror she had once wielded effortlessly, but it landed hollow in the charged atmosphere, swallowed by the disciplined stillness of those around her. Samuel's voice cut sharply through the tension, deliberate and measured. You thought dominance was attainable. You thought fear could never be mastered. Watch now as your own creation becomes your undoing. The widow's pupils dilated, comprehension flashing across her face, the horrifying understanding that her reign was no longer absolute, that her size and cruelty were insufficient to overcome the coordinated, calculated will of those she had tormented. Every movement she made, every flail, every desperate lunge, was anticipated, redirected, neutralized. The walls of the house seemed to close in, bearing silent witness to the transformation of terror into mastery, of victimhood into power. The widow's tyranny, built on mass, intimidation, and cruelty, had crumbled. She could neither rise nor fight. She could only lie, aware of the irreversible shift. The 11, standing unbroken, felt the gravity of the moment. They had converted years of suffering into disciplined action, fear into control, and desperation into dominance. In that room, the rules had changed forever, and the widow, once a force of unstoppable terror, was reduced to a body beneath eyes that no longer bowed in fear, eyes that now dictated the rhythm of the world she had sought to command. The widow's breaths came in ragged, uneven gasps, each inhale and exhale a brutal reminder that the empire she had built with weight, cruelty, and fear was now nothing but shattered illusion. Her massive arms flailed helplessly, shoulders trembling, her legs buckling as the chest pressed firmly against them, reinforced by the unyielding stance of the 11 who had transformed fear into precise, unbreakable control. Samuel's knife remained at his side, a silent emblem, a marker of the order that had replaced chaos. The widow's eyes darted frantically across the circle, seeking hesitation, a falter, any sign of the old dominance she had wielded for years. But the 11 did not flinch. Their movements were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet in those slight shifts, the widow's every effort to rise or lunge was counted, redirected, or neutralized. Lena's sharp gaze tracked the minute tremors in the widow's massive frame, the slight lean of her torso, the trembling in her knees, the minute lift of her shoulders, feeding the information to Jonah, who adjusted the positions of the others with silent precision. Every flail, every attempt to reclaim control, only confirmed the mastery of the 11. Her guttural cries reverberated against the walls, powerful yet hollow, echoes of terror transformed into futility. Samuel leaned closer, his voice calm, deliberate, cutting through the charged tension. You ruled through fear. We have endured it, learned it, and now it bends to us. The widow's lips quivered, panic and disbelief mingling as comprehension dawned, the terrifying realization that her reign, once absolute, was over, and that her own tools of domination had been transformed into instruments of her containment. The room seemed to pulse with electric intensity, walls absorbing the silent victory, the house itself witnessing the inversion of power. Every motion, every breath, every heartbeat was accounted for, measured, contained. Her mass, once an instrument of terror, had become the anchor of her imprisonment. In that suffocating stillness, the 11 became more than survivors. They were orchestrators of a new order, architects of control born from observation, endurance, and disciplined will. The widow's tyranny lay in ruins, shattered by the very children she had sought to crush, reduced to a body trembling beneath eyes that no longer feared. And as the flickering lanterns cast jagged shadows across the floor, it was clear. The rules of this house, the rhythm of power, had shifted irreversibly, and the 11 stood as silent, unbreakable arbiters of a new reality she could never reclaim. The widow's massive body quivered, each shudder a grotesque echo of the fear she had once imposed on others, now returned in full measure. Her chest rose and fell with ragged, uneven breaths, and the room seemed to contract around her, shadows from the flickering lanterns stretching long and jagged, framing the inevitability of her defeat. The 11 moved in near-silent coordination, a web of precision that anticipated her every desperate motion before it even began. Samuel's knife rested lightly at his side, not as a threat but as a marker of control, the unspoken assertion that power now belonged to those who had learned to endure, observe, and strike with deliberate intelligence. The widow attempted to push herself upright, massive arms trembling, knees buckling beneath her own weight, but every shift was anticipated. 2 boys reinforced the chest holding her legs, adjusting its angle imperceptibly to counter her momentum, while others subtly altered their positions to maintain perfect containment. Her eyes darted wildly, searching for mercy, hesitation, a return to the fear-driven obedience she had commanded, but found only calm, unflinching resolve. Lena observed the tiniest tremors in her shoulders, the wobble in her torso, the subtle slackening in her arms, relaying the information to Jonah, who moved imperceptibly to guide the circle's adjustments. The widow roared, a guttural, animalistic sound meant to intimidate, but it fell flat, swallowed by the unyielding unity of those around her. Samuel's voice broke the tension, low and deliberate. You built your empire on fear. We have mastered it, and it is ours now. Comprehension struck her like a blow. Every desperate lunge, every motion meant to reassert dominance was anticipated, contained, neutralized. The walls seemed to lean closer, bearing witness to the shift, as if the house itself acknowledged that tyranny had fallen. Her mass, her strength, her cruelty, all her tools of power, had become liabilities, anchors holding her in place as the 11 asserted a new order. Every micro-movement of her body was catalogued, exploited, and controlled, and with each passing second, the widow's realization deepened. She was no longer the force in this room. The 11 had become architects of authority, converting fear into precision, endurance into dominance, and observation into mastery. Silence settled thick and oppressive, charged with the gravity of what had transpired. The widow lay beneath eyes that no longer feared, in a house that no longer obeyed her, and in that moment, the immutable truth of power was revealed. It belonged to those who survived, learned, and acted with unwavering discipline. She had been defeated completely, irreversibly, and nothing could restore the reign she had once assumed unassailable. The widow's breaths grew shallow and uneven, each one a brutal acknowledgment of the futility she now faced. Her massive frame quivered, a grotesque testament to the collapse of the power she had wielded with unchallenged ferocity for so long. The 11 moved like a single organism, each micro-adjustment purposeful, every subtle shift synchronized to maintain control over her enormous, faltering body. Samuel's knife hung at his side, a silent emblem of authority, a marker of the balance that had irrevocably shifted. The widow's eyes darted frantically, scanning the circle for hesitation, mercy, a hint of the fear she had once commanded, but none existed. Every attempt to rise, every flail, every desperate twist was anticipated, blocked, redirected by the calculated coordination of the 11 who had transformed terror into power. 2 boys pressed the chest harder against her legs, immobilizing her lower body, while the others fanned around her, their presence a living net of precision and patience. Lena's sharp gaze traced the minute tremors in the widow's shoulders, the slackening in her massive arms, the slight imbalance of her torso, silently signaling Jonah to guide adjustments in the formation. The widow roared, a guttural, desperate sound meant to intimidate, but it echoed hollowly, a fading echo of dominance that no longer existed. Samuel's voice cut through the tense air, low, commanding, and unflinching. Fear is not yours to wield. It belongs to those who have endured it, mastered it, and now command it. Her eyes widened, comprehension dawning with terrifying clarity. The truth she had refused to see for years. Her reign was over. Every motion she made, every desperate surge of energy, only reinforced the mastery of the 11. The house seemed to settle around them, as if acknowledging the irreversible shift of power. Her tyranny, built on size, cruelty, and intimidation, had been dismantled not by chance or brute force, but by patience, strategy, and unity. Each flail, each attempt to reclaim control, was catalogued, anticipated, and neutralized. The 11 stood silent and still, yet their presence was absolute, a dark testament to the transformation of fear into discipline, oppression into strategy, desperation into mastery. The widow's mass, once a weapon, had become the anchor of her own containment, and she lay beneath eyes that no longer flinched, witnessing a new order emerge from the ruins of her empire. In that charged silence, the 11 understood the immutable truth. Dominance belongs not to the cruel, but to those who endure, observe, and act with calculated precision. The widow's massive frame lay heaving, every breath a struggle, every trembling movement a testament to the total collapse of the authority she had once wielded without question. The 11 moved around her with fluid precision, silent and deliberate, a coordinated force of patience, observation, and unyielding resolve. Samuel's knife remained at his side, not as a weapon, but as a symbol of the balance of power that had shifted irrevocably. The widow attempted to push herself up, her arms shaking violently, her legs buckling under their own weight, but the 11 anticipated every flail, every lurch, neutralizing it before it could manifest into threat. 2 boys pressed the chest tighter against the legs, ensuring she remained immobilized, while the others subtly shifted positions, closing any gaps, creating an unbreakable perimeter. Her eyes darted wildly across the circle, searching for hesitation, for mercy, for any sign of the old fear-driven obedience she had exploited for years, but found only cold, unwavering intent. Lena tracked every subtle tremor, every tiny shift in her shoulders or torso, relaying it with a glance to Jonah, who subtly adjusted the formation, maintaining absolute control. The widow roared, a guttural, primal sound, meant to intimidate, to reclaim some fragment of dominance, but it fell hollow against the disciplined silence of the 11. Samuel stepped closer, voice calm, deliberate, cutting through the tension. You believed fear would last forever. We have endured it. We have learned it. And now it obeys us. Understanding struck the widow like a hammer. Her reign, built on weight, cruelty, and terror, was dismantled. Each desperate motion she made only reinforced the mastery of those she had underestimated. The house seemed to absorb the shift, walls and floorboards bearing witness to the collapse of tyranny and the rise of disciplined control. Her mass, her size, her cruelty, all had become liabilities, instruments of her own containment. Every micro-movement, every trembling flail, was accounted for, neutralized, transformed into leverage by the 11. Silence settled heavy and permanent, charged with the gravity of transformation. The widow lay beneath eyes that no longer feared her, witnessing the emergence of a new order from the ruins of her empire. She realized fully, and too late, that domination is meaningless without vigilance, strategy, and awareness, and that the tools of cruelty she had relied upon could be turned against her in a single, precise, unified motion. The 11 had become the architects of control, and in that room, the rules of power had shifted irreversibly. The widow lay trembling, every breath ragged, every movement betraying the sheer exhaustion that had overtaken her colossal frame. Her massive arms twitched, legs faltered, and the chest pressing against her lower body anchored her like a living trap. The 11 moved with the grace and precision of predators who no longer hunted but ruled the moment with absolute control. Samuel's knife rested lightly at his side, not a threat, but a symbol of the new hierarchy, the invisible line of authority now held by those who had endured, observed, and mastered fear itself. The widow tried again to rise, but her bulk betrayed her. Every shift anticipated, every motion countered with silent, deliberate adjustments. 2 boys pressed the chest harder, reinforcing the grip on her legs, while the others subtly shifted their stances, maintaining an unbreakable circle around her. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for hesitation, for mercy, for a return to the terror she had once commanded, but found only focus, resolve, and unflinching control. Lena's gaze tracked every tremor in her shoulders, the micro-movements of her arms, the faintest shift in her torso, relaying through Jonah to coordinate subtle adjustments in the formation. The widow roared, a guttural, raw sound, intended to intimidate, but it landed hollow against the unity and discipline surrounding her. Samuel's voice, calm, deliberate, and cold, cut through the tension. You thought fear was yours. You were wrong. It is ours now. The widow's comprehension hit her like a physical blow. Every desperate lunge, every futile attempt at authority, had been anticipated and neutralized. The house itself seemed to shiver in recognition, the walls and floorboards bearing silent witness to the collapse of her dominion. Her weight, her strength, her cruelty, once instruments of oppression, were now chains holding her immobile, every movement catalogued, every effort counted. The 11 stood like living statues, embodiments of endurance, observation, and calculated will. The widow had ruled through terror, but terror had been transformed into mastery, oppression into awareness, fear into precise control. Silence, thick and suffocating, settled in the room, a charged acknowledgment of the irreversible shift. She lay beneath eyes that no longer feared her, under the control of those she had thought weak. In that moment, the true nature of power was revealed. It belonged to those who survive, who watch, who act with discipline, and who convert fear into unbreakable command. Her reign had ended, and nothing could restore it. The widow's massive frame trembled, every motion labored, each gasp for air a testament to the collapse of a reign built on weight, terror, and cruelty. Her eyes darted frantically across the 11 who now encircled her, searching for weakness, for hesitation, for the familiar fear that had once bent them to her will, but found none. Each movement she attempted was anticipated, counted, and neutralized with silent precision. 2 boys pressed the chest more firmly against her legs, preventing any leverage, while the others adjusted minutely, forming a perfect containment that she could not disrupt. Samuel's knife hung at his side, not a weapon of aggression but a marker of authority, a symbol of the balance that had irrevocably shifted. Lena tracked the faint tremors of her shoulders, the quiver in her arms, the subtle lean of her torso, relaying it silently to Jonah, who coordinated adjustments to maintain their flawless control. The widow let out a guttural, desperate scream, a primal attempt to reclaim dominance, but it fell hollow against the unyielding focus and unity surrounding her. Samuel's voice, low, deliberate, and unflinching, cut through the thick tension. You believed terror was eternal. We have learned it, and now it obeys us. The widow's comprehension hit like a hammer, the crushing realization that her reign was over, dismantled not by brute force, but by patience, observation, and coordinated will. Every desperate flail, every twitch of her massive body, only reinforced the mastery of those she had underestimated. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, walls absorbing the monumental shift as the collapse of tyranny gave rise to disciplined dominance. Her bulk, her mass, her history of cruelty, all her instruments of power, had become chains binding her to the floor, her every motion catalogued and controlled. The 11 had converted fear into strategy, oppression into precision, and desperation into mastery. Silence settled heavily, thick and electric, charged with the gravity of transformation. The widow lay beneath eyes that no longer feared her. Her authority dissolved, her terror inverted into the very force that now ruled over her. In that moment, she understood the immutable truth of power. It does not belong to the cruel, to the heavy, to those who intimidate by sheer presence. It belongs to those who endure, observe, and act with unflinching discipline. Her reign had ended completely, and nothing could restore it. The widow's body quivered, her massive frame trembling under the weight of absolute defeat. Every inhale and exhale came ragged, labored, each one a brutal confirmation that her reign, built on size, cruelty, and terror, had crumbled. The 11 moved with a precision that made the air itself seem taut, every subtle shift a calculated measure of control. Samuel's knife hung at his side, its presence a quiet emblem of authority, a reminder that dominion no longer belonged to brute force, but to discipline, observation, and unity. The widow's eyes darted frantically across their circle, desperate for hesitation, mercy, a return to the fear she had long commanded, but found none. Her massive arms flailed, legs buckled, her bulk betraying every movement she tried to force into dominance, each flail catalogued, anticipated, and neutralized. 2 boys reinforced the chest pressing against the legs, while the others subtly adjusted their stances, closing any possible escape or leverage. Lena's sharp gaze tracked the smallest tremors, the quiver of shoulders, the slight shift in torso, the slackening in her arms, and relayed it silently to Jonah, who fine-tuned their formation with imperceptible gestures. The widow screamed, guttural, raw, primal, an attempt to reclaim authority, but it fell hollow, swallowed by the unwavering stillness of those around her. Samuel stepped closer, voice cold and deliberate. You believed fear was yours. We endured it, we mastered it, and now it bends to our will. Comprehension struck her fully. Every desperate lunge, every futile attempt to regain control, was anticipated, counted, and rendered meaningless. The walls seemed to lean closer, the floorboards groaning as if acknowledging the shift, bearing witness to the collapse of tyranny and the emergence of a new, calculated order. Her mass, once a weapon of oppression, now anchored her in immobility. Each movement transformed into leverage for those she had underestimated. The 11 stood silent, statuesque, embodying endurance, intelligence, and relentless willpower. Fear had been converted into mastery, cruelty into strategy, desperation into precision. The widow, trembling and defeated, lay beneath eyes that no longer feared her, in a room that had witnessed the rise of a new order. In that charged silence, the lesson was clear and irreversible. Dominance belongs not to the cruel, the massive, or the terror-inducing. It belongs to those who endure, who watch, and who act with unflinching discipline. Her empire of fear had ended, and nothing could restore it. The widow lay utterly defeated, her massive body trembling, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with the terrifying realization that everything she had built through fear and cruelty had collapsed. The room seemed to hold its breath, thick with the electric tension of finality. The 11 stood like statues of control, each movement deliberate, each gaze sharp, each presence a living testament to endurance, observation, and calculated mastery. Samuel's knife remained at his side, not as a threat, but as the symbol of the order that had replaced chaos. Her massive arms twitched, legs faltered, every attempt to rise, to reclaim authority, met with the silent precision of those who had endured and learned her tactics. 2 boys reinforced the chest against the legs, while the others adjusted minutely, closing every possible gap, maintaining a flawless containment that she could not break. Lena's eyes scanned every detail, the tremor of her shoulders, the minute slack in her arms, the faltering balance of her torso, relaying imperceptibly to Jonah, who subtly guided the formation to absolute control. The widow screamed, raw and guttural, a desperate attempt at dominance that rang hollow in the charged air, swallowed by the discipline of the 11. Samuel stepped closer, voice calm, deliberate, cutting through the tension. You believed fear was yours to command. We endured it. We mastered it. It belongs to us now. Comprehension struck her fully, and the horrifying truth settled into her mind. Her reign had ended, dismantled not by strength, but by patience, intelligence, and unity. The walls seemed to lean closer, the house itself acknowledging the shift, bearing witness to the collapse of tyranny. Her mass, her size, her cruelty, all her instruments of oppression, had become chains binding her in place, every movement catalogued, counted, and neutralized. The 11 stood silent, statuesque, embodying strategy, resilience, and unbreakable will. The widow, trembling beneath their gaze, understood finally that true power is not intimidation, weight, or fear. It is awareness, discipline, and the ability to act with precise, unflinching control. And in that suffocating, heavy silence, the old order had ended, and a new one had risen. The 11 were no longer survivors, they were masters, architects of a calculated reality forged from endurance, observation, and deliberate action. And the widow, once feared beyond measure, lay beneath eyes that would never flinch, her empire of terror dissolved forever, leaving only the inescapable truth. Power respects only those who have endured, learned, and act without hesitation.